So myself, Amla George, faculty of the Department of Development Economics. So first of all, let me invite Head of the Department, Dr. Jiji Kumari ma'am, for the welcome speech.
Thank you, Amala. Good afternoon to one and all. Respected Principal Sri Biju Joseph, distinguished guest of the day, Dr. Rory Horner, faculties and students from other institutions, my colleagues and my dear students. It is an honor and privilege for me to welcome you on behalf of the St. Pius X College, Rajapuram, to this international webinar on the making of India's pharmaceutical industry and implications in Africa, which has been organized by PG Department of Development Economics in connection with ILLUMINISMO 2021 International Webinar Series on the emerging trends in interdisciplinary sciences and social sciences. First, I wish to extend my deep appreciation to Dr. Justin Joy and other faculty members of the Department of Economics to bring this program into reality. Today, we are going to discuss about India's pharmaceutical industry and its implications in Africa. As you know, especially in 2016, our Prime Minister visited South Africa with two objectives like mutual economic interest and common development aspirations. The pharmaceutical sector presents a meeting point for both goals of exporting medicines to Africa as well as creating manufacturing bases in Africa. The India-Africa Partnership on Medicine Access has been a long-standing one. In 2001, when pharmaceutical giants were suing with the South African government for attempting to source cheaper forms of antiretroviral drugs, Indian generic drug manufacturer Cipla volunteered to sell the generic version of less than $1 a day in Africa. The beginnings of this partnership in many ways paved the way for the development of Global Action Plan on Access to Medicines. The United Nations introduced a high-level panel on access to medicines, and both the Millennium Development Goals and its successor, the Sustainable Development Goals, include specific targets dealing with this issue. India still remains a major supplier of affordable essential drugs to developing countries. Today, Indian-made ARV drugs constitute 80% of Africa's total consumption. According to Medicine Sans Frontiers, India is the principal source of pharmaceutical drugs by volume for South Africa. Indian generic companies stand to benefit significantly by investing in Africa. Make in Africa allows Indian companies to continue expanding medicines access regardless of many possible future alterations in India's IPR policy. On Africa's side, there are also obvious benefits. Local production means a more reliable source of pharmaceutical under public control. Domestic manufacturing also brings with it more jobs in the pharmaceutical sector and related sectors. I am delighted to welcome all the distinguished participants. Then I have the privilege and honor to welcome the speaker for today, Dr. Rory Horner. Dr. Rory, many thanks for joining with us, accepting our invitation. A very warm welcome you, sir, on behalf of PG Department of Development Economics. Dear friends, I would like to read the profile of Dr. Rory Horner, today's speaker. A senior lecturer in globalization and political economy in the Global Development Institute, University of Manchester, UK, since 2013. They awarded PhD from Clark University on the topic, Changing Geographies of Global Development with a specific focus on South-South trade and pharmaceutical industry. They conducted research for various periods of time in India, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Ghana, and South Africa. He was appointed as Economic and Social Research Council Future Research Leader between the period 2016 to 20 to lead a project on India's pharmaceuticals, local production, and public health security in sub-Saharan Africa comparative study. Around 34 publications in international journals, including the topics on COVID-19 and global development. Moreover, he was honored with the recognitions and awards. Regional Development and Planning Specialty Group, aka the Best Graduate Student Paper Award in 2013. In 2009, he awarded Economic Geography Specialty Group Best Student Paper Award and Area Prize for New Research in Geography in 2014. Then welcome you, sir, to this session. Next, I would like to welcome our principal, Sri Biju Joseph, who was actually the backbone of this webinar series. Then welcome all faculties, research scholars, industrialists, and students from other institutions, those who are gathered here for this webinar. Last but not least, I would like to welcome the members of the organizing committee of this webinar, faculties and students from our own college, those who are attending here. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that by participating in this webinar, we are in the right place and right time. Together, let us accelerate the exchange of ideas and scaling up of good practices. I'm confident that you will find new ideas and fresh energy from this webinar. I would like to conclude by again welcoming all. I wish you all a very successful interactions and discussions and assure you of the full support of myself and my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for your warm welcome. So now let us move on to the main talk. So now I invite Dr. Rory Horner, Senior Lecturer, University of Manchester, to lead the talk. Over to you, Dr. Rory Horner.
Thank you so much for the very kind introductions and also for the welcome to the very extremely informed welcome and introduction, which has already given a great overview of the topic of India's pharmaceuticals in Africa. And it's great to be here with you today, albeit virtually and hopefully physically one day in the future. I am going to talk about India's pharmaceutical industry and its implications in Africa, which is, of course, a very current topic, the pharmaceutical industry and anything to do with it in the context of the very devastating pandemic, which the world has been experiencing over the past 18 months, but has long-standing extreme importance, not just on the economic side, but particularly for its health implications. And that is where I think a really key theme in this talk, that this is not just a talk about industrial development or global trade or participation in the global economy. This is the health implications of an extremely important industry. So we can think about how does industrial development take place in the global economy. And the story I want to talk about, and this is building on my research, but there's also great other scholars, Sudeep Chowdhury, Reggie Joseph, and others who've done great work on India's pharmaceutical industry, about, and particularly within India, how the industry initially emerged, which I'll talk about briefly, which is really about beyond just integrating into the global economy. We have a lot of development agendas today which are about becoming suppliers in global value chains, global supply chains, which are still controlled by high firms in high-income countries. And I think the Indian pharmaceutical story right from the beginning is about being more ambitious than that. It's about creating the kind of major pharmaceutical firms themselves rather than just becoming suppliers. So a stage of dislodging the multinationals and then constructing these south-south value chains, which are of great significance in particular in Africa, but also have relevance in many other low and middle income countries. So to start off, and there was in the initial post-independence period, the pharmaceutical industry in India was heavily controlled by foreign-owned multinationals. This is a list here, and which shows their year of entry on the left-hand side and the names of some of these companies. Some of these companies are still present today, although there's been a lot of mergers and acquisitions in the industry. So some of them are actually part of bigger firms today. But if you look on the right-hand side, what is key really, I think, is whether there is formulation production or bulk drug production. Bulk drugs is the initial ingredient stage of manufacturing a drug, which is a much more chemical intensive part of production. And formulation is turning that into a liquid, a tablet, a capsule, the common formats in which humans and also animals for veterinary products consume drugs. So there was almost no bulk drug production and also very little formulation production in India at the time. India relied on imported medicines brought in by foreign multinationals, and the price of drugs in India were amongst the highest in the world. A US Senate committee investigation report in the early 1960s found. So little manufacturing and extremely expensive drugs. Just to highlight this as a starting point. So then, of course, the 1970s is a really transformative decade in the context of the development of India's pharmaceutical industry. What attracts a huge amount of attention is the Indian Patent Act, which is undeniable in its influence. A number of drugs were launched in various in Europe and North America, and within a small number of years, they were then made available in India. The Indian Patent Act removed patents on drug products and only allowed for very short process patents. So essentially, there was very limited patent protection, and this had been revoking much greater patent protection, which had been in place from colonial times under from the 1911 under British rule. What's I think really important to emphasize, though, is many other countries did not have much patent protection in the pharmaceutical industry in the 1970s and 1980s. Other countries either never had it or reduced the amount of patent protection, yet they didn't develop anywhere near as significant a domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing industry as India. So there's a case here for some other industrial policy and other measures of Foreign Exchange Regulation Act and new drug policies, which had measures which compelled companies to do local production if they wanted to serve and supply the Indian domestic market. So those were really, really significant, I think, in partly, they didn't necessarily achieve all of their aims and other aims, but they did help encourage local manufacturing and foreign manufacturers to invest in local manufacturing. And I'm just going to mention the message in the chat. Various people are illustrating on the screen, and it seems to be then showing up for everybody. So if it's okay, if you can avoid that, because it makes the screen a little bit messy for everybody. Thank you. So this is a quote from an interviewee who I talked to from a pharmaceutical company in Hyderabad, saying, I actually developed ibuprofen when I was in Standard Organics. Standard Organics, and then from the journals used to be there, chemical abstracts, we used to go to chemical abstracts, the things note down and physically write the books and everything. Without any cooperation with major international pharmaceutical companies, scientists based in Indian pharmaceutical firms were able to imitate, or what is commonly referred to as reverse engineer, common drugs, and do that in a relatively quick period of time and supply them to the Indian market. As this interview also explained, we weren't governed in the patent law. The multinationals say you cannot market a brand, but you can re-engineer and you can market the similar brand product in a different manufacturing form or different process. That was the breakthrough. And there's a period then when we move from MNCs controlling 80 to 90% of the Indian pharmaceutical market in 1970, to that share falling to 39% in 1993, and subsequently to less than 30%. At the same time as this table, which I've just shown here, shows the price of Indian drugs fell enormously. This is just a comparison from the 1980s of sort of prices of some drugs in India versus in the UK. And most of those drugs are 20, 30%, if not less, of the price of those drugs in the UK. So within about 20 to 30 years, there's enormous reduction in the price of drugs in India, at the same time as much greater supply from Indian-owned firms rather than foreign multinationals. Now, this is significant not just for India, where obviously India's pharmaceutical industry continues to be significant, but also attracted attention elsewhere. I think never more prominently than in 2001, when Dr. Yusuf Hamid the then CEO and chairman of CIPLA, announced that his company would supply a year's supply of antiretroviral drugs for people living with HIV/AIDS for $350 a year, which was enormous reduction on what had been the $10,000 a year cost they had been until that point of view. The AIDS epidemic had begun to be controlled in higher income countries where antiretroviral drugs were available, but in many low and middle income countries, the death rate continued to be enormously high. And CIPLA, through this announcement, began the process of revolutionizing the process of supply of antiretroviral drugs, which helped transform HIV/AIDS away from being an automatic killer into being more of a manageable disease for those who could access antiretrovirals. India's pharmaceutical industry then attracts much more global attention in the context of very intense debates around patent law, in the context of the World Trade Organization TRIPS agreement, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, which became a condition of membership for any country signing up to become a member of the World Trade Organization, which India did in 1994 and had an adjustment period until 2005 in terms of its patent law. Very intense debates emerged around would this cut off the supply of generic drugs from India, which are so vital for health elsewhere. And partly because many drugs had already come off patent, partly because of some public health measures which activists fought for in the TRIPS agreement, and also at a national level to ensure that the generic drug industry could continue. Indian drugs, for the most part, have continued to be supplied around the world since the TRIPS agreement, although there are some drugs which might have been available if there was less patent protection. So this global attention emerges on India as the pharmacy of the developing world, which was a term that those in Médecins Sans Frontières came up with to highlight India's key role. This is all of the details aren't necessary to read here, but this is important to emphasize that it was global civil society access to medicines activists which were highlighting the key benefits of India's pharmaceutical industry. It wasn't just something that the Indian government was highlighting was beneficial, or which the Indian industry, which of course will want to claim that it was beneficial. Now, I know some people have commented elsewhere, pharmacy to the developing world, but not to India, because some drugs are either expensive within India, or there are also sometimes lower quality drugs at some points which are available. So this term is not without criticism, and there are many different aspects to this term. But the general point is that India's pharmaceutical industry began to attract attention for playing a major role in supplying medicines to other low and middle income countries, which were vital for health. Now, we've known for quite some time that India supplies a lot of medicines. So part of my research in the last few years has been around trying to understand what are the supply chains through which some of these medicines reach other low and middle income countries, particularly in Africa, but also what are the local implications, not just for industrial development, but also for health. Just to highlight here, this is from 2015, some data from Pharmexil, the Pharmaceutical Export Promotion Council, which shows the destination of India's pharmaceutical exports. As you can see, North America is on at the top for 29%, but Europe is in yellow for 18%. So 47% or so for Europe and North America, and then approximately 53% for the rest of the world, which Asia would, of course, include Japan and a couple other high-income countries. But for the most part, we can think of India's pharmaceuticals as actually almost a 50-50 split in terms of direction. 50% to high-income countries and 50% to low and middle-income countries. Now, this is a measure by revenue terms or value. So if we were to actually think of this by volume, the price of much of these drugs going to low and middle income countries is substantially lower. So actually in volume terms, as a share of the total number of physical drugs, much more are going to low and middle income countries. But in the revenue share generated, it's about half and half, because the high income countries are more lucrative markets to export to. There are various, though, debates then and perspectives around, well, these exports of pharmaceuticals from India, as this headline from a piece of praise from former US President Bill Clinton says, praising Indian companies for selling cheap HIV drugs to Africa. That, of course, is the kind of the real positive side being pointed to. And this connects with long-standing ideas and the role of India in South-South cooperation and South-South development relations. This win-win idea of India is something that being good for India, but also being very positive for development elsewhere. Then there are, though, accusations which sometimes come up, and some suggest they're driven by a big pharma lobby in Europe and North America around whether India, and questions around whether India may be sending low-quality medicines to Africa. And then some, of course, point that, well, some of these accusations are coming from global lobbies connected to big pharma interests. As I'm going to talk about a little bit more, there's actually a number of distinct supply chains through which India's pharmaceutical exports reach countries in sub-Saharan Africa, which have different quality standards and different degrees of regulation and stringency involved in them. I want to highlight here just the significance of India's pharmaceutical in terms of a pharmaceutical supply in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. These are the countries which are the top 6 countries which India supplies pharmaceuticals to. And on the left-hand column is the share of imports for these countries which came from India in 2001 versus the share of total imports coming from India in 2018 of pharmaceuticals. Now, apart from South Africa, most of these countries have relatively small shares of local manufacturing. So what we're talking here is, although it's a share of imports, it's actually, if it's a big share of imports, it's therefore a big share of the country's total source of medicines is coming from India. And we see enormous increases across all 6 of these countries, to such an extent where for a number of these countries, Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, and Tanzania, more than 50% of pharmaceutical imports are now sourced from India. And this is another version of this, which just shows who the other, the largest sort of non-India supplier. And Germany, France, UK, South Africa, Netherlands, for all these countries were much more in 2001, but now India is vastly the biggest import source for all of these countries in 2018. Indian firms have a number of advantages in being able to supply to and being very competitive in exporting to other low and middle income countries. There's access to raw materials and related industries. A side story there is, of course, that India's pharmaceutical industry has become more reliant on ingredients from China, of active pharmaceutical ingredients, which there are various measures to address, and government of India has been promoting especially in the last 18 months or so, to try and promote greater ingredients. But nevertheless, for the most part, there is a good range of raw materials and related industries. There is enormous economies of scale, and there are capabilities to produce across a variety of quality standards. A firm can produce one drug in one plant for a high-income export market, and another drug in a different, and the same drug in a different plant for the Indian domestic market, or another lower or middle income country market. There are different ways Indian firms access and export to other markets in Africa especially. One route is through international tenders. The Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and malaria, Indian firms are by far the biggest supplier to. These are very strict quality standards involved in this through the World Health Organization. There's also national tenders. In many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, approximately 50% of the pharmaceutical market is public procurement. The government supplies purchases and supplies drugs to people who cannot afford them. And then 50% in revenue terms is the private market. Of course, in volume terms, much more would be public procurement. So Indian firms participate in and win national tenders from various governments. Then there are also the role in supplying through private markets. This is directly selling through pharmacists and other retailers. So there's actually, in a way, 3 different types of chains through which Indian drugs are supplied to many countries in Africa in particular, but also elsewhere. Indian firms, for the most extent, just supply finished products, as in they finish the manufacturing in India and export and just do distribution within many countries in Africa. That said, there are a small number and very prominent examples of pharmaceutical formulation manufacturing by Indian-owned firms in a number of countries in Africa. Ranbaxy, which is now under Sun Pharma, in Nigeria. This is actually notable in the kind of history of Indian economic development as the very first overseas foreign direct investment by an Indian company was by Ranbaxy in Nigeria in 1977. Some more recent ones, though, are by Cipla in Uganda. This picture here on the right is of Cipla, a very small picture is of Cipla Quality Chemicals, a venture between Cipla and the government of Uganda in Kampala, which is perhaps the most advanced pharmaceutical plant outside South Africa in the continent, or at least in sub-Saharan Africa, and which is a very important example. Cadillas also and others do have some manufacturing presence. But when we compare the fact that there are actually, well, in total, there are estimated to be more than 10,000 pharmaceutical firms in India's pharmaceutical industry, and hundreds of these firms are exporting to Africa. It's actually only a very tiny fraction of Indian pharmaceutical firms which do have manufacturing in Africa. And a small portion of the drugs supplied from India are manufactured locally compared to those which are imported. South African, so just as an example, many firms then need to work with local distribution firms. So in the context of South Africa, it's often local firms which do the marketing and distribution of Indian products. The local firms have greater sort of market presence and understanding of the local market and dynamics. They also assist with registration and marketing. So the managing director of a firm I interviewed in South Africa explained to me that Cipla didn't come in on their own. They came in with a South African affiliate. Arabindo also came in with a South African affiliate. It's only Ranbaxy that have gone on their own from day one, and I've said they've been the least effective. Cipla have done an awesome job, but it was a South African affiliate that made them successful, and Arabindo has also been successful. So in understanding, this is explaining the importance of local market understanding, but for the most extent relying on Indian manufacturing with local market understanding through local firms. This is from a South African example, but also applies to a number of other countries. Now, there's been concerns, though, that from a local manufacturing viewpoint, where although we have a small number of Indian firms which have invested in local manufacturing, Indian imports do also, though, provide quite a strong competitive challenge for many locally owned manufacturers in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. with the continent of Africa largely reliant on imported medicines, for estimated more than 90% of the continent's medicines, there has been an agenda from the African Union, from different regional blocs and national governments to promote greater local manufacturing of pharmaceuticals over the last decade or more. There's been a big policy interest in this. And some Indian firms have contributed to this through investing in local manufacturing. But for many locally owned manufacturers, they face a really strong competition from finished drugs which are imported from India, on which there is no import duties because of the health need. You don't want to make those drugs more expensive. So, and there's much less economies of scale for local manufacturers in Africa. They face difficulty reaching quality standards, many of them. There's small regional markets, which is a reason why you can't produce at the same scale as elsewhere. There's limited pool procurement, and import duties are not present to facilitate a health interest. So there's really strong challenges for local production from Indian competition. As a pharmacist I interviewed in a Kenyan company in Nairobi explained to me, and she said to me that inputs and raw materials are there with them, as are the packaging materials. They have, we don't. It is more expensive to get the raw materials here. Local transport is also quite high. Companies in India are huge. Maybe 5 Kenyan companies are one of theirs. If buying on a large scale, the price will be lower. In India, they think about local industry. And of course, many people I've interviewed in India have not necessarily said that there's been that much policy support, but in Africa, there's a definite feeling that there is much greater, a more supportive environment for the pharmaceutical manufacturing in India compared to that found in Africa, and it is a key competitive threat for local production. So I will just talk briefly about an example of South Africa, where so just to highlight, I guess, first, this is a huge pharmaceutical market. It's by far the biggest market in pharmaceutical market in Africa. South Africa actually, and it's not the only African country, a number of African countries actually did have quite a bit of local pharmaceutical manufacturing until the 1990s and early 2000s. South Africa now has about 26 manufacturing firms, but that's down from 29 at the end of apartheid just under 30 years ago. They're essentially only in the formulation stage of the pharmaceutical value chain, as are all other, the vast majority of other African countries. So they're completely reliant on import of active pharmaceutical ingredients and other raw materials from elsewhere. But there's been quite a significant decline in local manufacturing, despite policy initiatives to try and support local manufacturing. And one of the key reasons is the increasing prominence of India in generic pharmaceuticals. The blue line at the top of this chart shows, the darker blue line shows the significance of India, which is now a source of about 30% of pharmaceutical imports into South Africa in value terms, much greater again in volume terms because of that significance. Now, so India's playing a major role in South Africa's generic pharmaceutical industry, and so one interviewee from a local firm said, well, it's very hard to actually manufacture and be in South Africa and be competitive vis-a-vis importing from India. So if you can't beat them, join them. Form a partnership with an Indian firm, such as Pharmadynamics, Cipla, MedPro, which are big South African firms, which don't do much manufacturing in South Africa, but have partnerships with Indian companies to manufacture and then do all the marketing and distribution in South Africa. So that there's, in a way, mixed messages have come up in my research about, and from different people I talk to, about the implications of India's pharmaceutical industry in Africa. Of course, from the health side, there's almost uniform kind of agreement that it's been entirely beneficial. This is a quote from a media report from the then Health Minister of South Africa in 2015. We regard India as the pharmacy of the developing world. My message to India is that we rely on them, and if they reverse their position now, they will end up killing a lot of people in Africa, no question about it. That was about another potential discussion of a change in patent law at that particular time. But essentially, the viewpoint from the South African Ministry of Health, the enormous benefits of India's pharmaceutical industry for health in South Africa, but also pointing to elsewhere in the continent. Now, another, policymaker concerned more with industry factors in South Africa said, well, they present an image as missionaries, the pharmacy of the developing world. It's fantastic for antiretrovirals, but at the same time, they're undermining the capacity of our generic industry. But we can't blame the Indians. They have 1.3 billion people. Pharmaceutical is one of their success stories. So in a way, agreeing with the health, great for health, but it is really hard for developing local pharmaceutical manufacturing in South Africa when local firms need to compete with India. Another interviewee said, I think without the Indian pharma industry, South Africa would have suffered a lot. I think the Indians brought a lot to this country and changed the way we look at things and changed the costs and the sophistication. And no one was about to reduce prices and all the rest of it. So India changed what we could do here. So there's also, from a kind of industry point of view, examples in a number of countries of where local firms have actually learned from what has been done in India and from Indian people who are playing key roles in local manufacturing firms in South Africa, but also elsewhere in Africa. So I'm going to talk for the last little part about the contemporary situation of COVID-19 vaccines, where I've talked more broadly about India's pharmaceutical industry so far, but India is specifically for vaccines the biggest source of vaccines in the world, led, of course, by the Serum Institute of India, but not just only supplied by the Serum Institute of India. Now, India, in a way, has been, as my earlier talk through the broader pharmaceutical situation, India has been key in sort of global health for antiretrovirals, for antimalarials, TB medication, great for public health in a number of areas. In a way, for the whole world, without supply from India, the global public health situation would be a lot worse. So once COVID-19 breaks out, of course, in many ways, there's a lot of, and India's been key for making drugs and vaccines accessible. So once COVID-19 breaks out and there start to be various vaccines developed, a key thing is, well, if the world is to get access, how we do it with other drugs and vaccines is Indian manufacturers play a key role. So it was natural to look to Indian manufacturers to help scale up COVID-19 vaccines and for them to play a key role in making COVID-19 vaccines globally accessible. So the Oxford University AstraZeneca vaccine attracted a lot of attention initially, especially because compared to the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, there was much less cold chain requirements in terms of the initial studies, what the initial studies indicated. So it appeared to be much more suitable for low and middle income countries. And through mediation from Gavi and the Gates Foundation, a major agreement was signed as early as spring 2020 for the scaling up of that vaccine by the Serum Institute of India to supply more than 1 billion doses by the end of 2021. And this was, I guess, a lot of attention has focused from early stages and continues to be now, though, about who gets access to the vaccines that are manufactured in India. Now, one of the first public statements on this was from, I guess, a household name, not just in India, but elsewhere now, Adar Poonawalla, the Serum Institute CEO, who just over a year ago said of whatever he produces, out of whatever he produces, 50% to India and 50% to the rest of the world. Now, the key thing that's missing from this statement, of course, is when does India get, in what sequence and with what prioritization does India get 50% and the rest of the world get 50%? There were a lot of public statements from, including the Vinod Paul, the chairperson of India's COVID task force, emphasizing how the vaccine was not just for India, but for the world and humanity. And it was on that basis on which the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was licensed to the Serum Institute, not just to supply India, but to supply other low and middle income countries too. I think it was about 90 countries which were scheduled to receive the initial supply. And this and many of the initial vaccines which reached a number of countries, especially low and middle income countries, were from India. You might remember, it probably feels like a long time ago now, when not just India, but India in particular was in a very different situation in relation to the pandemic. There were a lot of sort of quite celebratory announcements about how vaccines had been supplied from India to Nepal, to Maldives, to Bangladesh, to a number of other countries. These were the very first vaccines supplied, and made a really big difference in being able to vaccinate some older and highly vulnerable people first. A friend of mine, his parents in Nepal were vaccinated before my own parents in Ireland, for example, there was some really initial great progress made in vaccination elsewhere. But as the Indian domestic cases and severity of the pandemic really hit again, as the proceeding through February and March, there was signs even from February, skepticism from Adar Poonawalla about whether India would be able to meet its export commitments. There's been an enormous fall off in vaccine exports from India. So 60 million vaccines exported from January to March. And at one point in time, there had been more vaccines exported from India than supplied from Indian manufacturers to the local vaccination program within India. Now it's still a total of only another 6 million from late March to early May, and no vaccine exports since then. So it's about 66 million total vaccines have been exported. In contrast with yesterday's number, was a total of 485 million vaccines administered domestically within India. And a statement from May from Adar Poonawalla said, we also start to hope delivering to COVAX in other countries by the end of this year. So essentially exports have been cut off since March, April time, and there's at the moment, no scheduled vaccine exports from India until the end of the year. Now, this creates a massive shortfall for COVAX, which is the global vaccine sharing mechanism through the CEPI, Gavi, and the WHO. This COVAX has aimed for 2 billion doses in 2021 and still suggests that aim. The first doses were distributed from some Serum Institute vaccines sent to Ghana in February 2021. But more than 50% of these 2 billion doses for COVAX scheduled in 2021 were due to come from India. Most in this chart, in the darker, brighter blue, I don't know what to call it, bigger blue on the bottom of this chart, from the Serum Institute's manufacture of the AstraZeneca product, also some of the Novavax product, which is still waiting to come on stream. Now, given only 30 million have been supplied from India to COVAX to date, 10 million of those actually went COVAX to supply to India. That's an enormous shortfall from scheduled more than 1 billion doses supply from India to COVAX to only 30 million, so far, and likely, according to that statement from Adar Poonawalla, until the end of 2021. So the redirection of vaccine supply scheduled from COVAX and for export to other low and middle income countries to India's vaccination program has left COVAX with an enormous shortfall. Now, of course, there's clear health reasons why vaccines should be distributed to India, and it's of course not India's sole responsibility to supply the world. The world perhaps unnecessarily had over-reliance on India for supply to COVAX, and it was also because high-income countries had pursued a sort of national prioritizing domestic vaccination first, that there was very little support for COVAX from elsewhere, that the world was overly reliant on India, which has, of course, then created this major shortfall in vaccination elsewhere. So if we just look to the situation today of share of people who have received at least one dose of COVID-19 vaccine, this, of course, is quite high in the United Kingdom, EU and United States, which have been very selfish in supplying vaccines to their own populations before, vulnerable and older people elsewhere. But Brazil is now up at over 50%. China, the estimates vary. Some, I think that one report I've seen said about 1.7 billion doses have been administered in China. So it is estimated that a lot of, although the line doesn't actually appear on this chart. India is now, though, up about getting towards 30% of the population who have received one dose. But to highlight the vast difference with Africa, so there are where it's still less than 5% of people who have received one dose of COVID-19 vaccine. So yes, there are big inequalities between high-income countries and between middle-income countries, but also there are huge inequalities in terms of access to vaccines within the global south, especially when we compare countries with vaccine manufacturing capacity, such as China, India, and Brazil, compared to countries which were completely reliant on import of vaccines and largely through COVAX, such as in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's a particular shortfall there in and very worrying shortfall in Africa at the moment, which is still, there are announcements of some donations of vaccine being made, but they're still relatively small compared to the overall need of the supply. So just to conclude, and again, I've tried to cover quite a lot in a relatively short period of time. So some of the key messages are really that India has developed a hugely globally significant pharmaceutical industry through going beyond integrating into value chains oriented towards high-income countries. This is a development strategy which is pursued in across many industries in many countries, but India has always been about going beyond this to play a much more significant and prominent role in being the lead firms themselves in the pharmaceutical industry. India is the major supplier of pharmaceuticals, whether drugs or vaccines, to sub-Saharan Africa, as well as many low and middle income countries. There are huge benefits for public health elsewhere. South Africa, which I mentioned earlier, its life expectancy fell from in the mid-60s around the end of apartheid to in the mid-50s a decade later, as the country with the highest incidence of HIV AIDS in the world. Antiretrovirals have literally, from India, have literally played a massive role in increasing life expectancy in South Africa. But at the same time, with this longer term interest in greater health security, there are concerns from local manufacturers elsewhere that local production is being crowded out. So there are question marks for the future then around finding the right balance of the enormous benefits of India's pharmaceuticals for public health now, but also with being conducive to facilitating local manufacture elsewhere for greater health security, which policymakers in Africa are also interested in. So I'm going to conclude there and pass back to the chair.
Thank you, Dr. Rory Horner, for this very enriching session. So now we can move on to the discussion session. So everyone can ask questions, doubts, or then you can use the chat box or you can ask it. Okay.
Okay, well, maybe Dr. Rory, I'll go first. It was a very nice talk, and thank you, and sorry for the disturbance through that annotation and all. But my question is, India itself is struggling to provide vaccines for all its populations. So at this time, at what level India could support Africa?
I think it's really the rest of the world that should be supporting Africa now. I'm not sure the burden was unnecessarily placed on India. The world has always basically relied on India. Without India, many less medicines would have been provided and vaccines to Africa and other lower income countries in the last couple of decades. And the world relied too much on India in the context of the current pandemic. Of course, it's also related to promises that were made from India, and a belief, of course, that the pandemic was under control in India too. But what needs to happen now is vaccines are not just manufactured in India; they're manufactured in Europe.
Sir, please, your mic is muted. Sir, please.
Really sorry. Okay, sorry about that. So the world needs to look to other countries now, not India. The world has relied way too much on India to supply lower income countries. Vaccine manufacturers in countries in Europe and North America have neglected supply to lower income countries because it's not been commercially attractive, and left it to India to play that role. There's a clear domestic need for vaccines in India now. And so vaccines are not just manufactured in India, they're manufactured in Europe, America too, and those countries and companies need to step up. We're now getting media reports in the UK and Europe of preparations for third vaccines, of booster vaccines to be administered. The WHO has recently said yesterday, in the last week, that expressed a lot of concerns about this, that we're not just going to double vaccinate people in Europe and North America first. We're actually now going to have booster doses before many people in lower income countries have received a vaccine. So right now, India is still only vaccinated less than 30% of the population. Vaccines are still hugely needed in India, and it's other countries which need to step up. I think the broader issue of why this situation has emerged, though, is over-reliance on India to supply lower-income countries for a long period of time, not just for COVID vaccines, but for other drugs too.
So I have one doubt. That is, you showed one slide relating to the intake of COVID first dose vaccine. It is comparatively low in South Africa than other countries or developed countries. Then I think it may be because of the impact of COVID-19 on South Africa is comparatively low. Is it correct, sir?
So the South Africa chart was more relating to the broader pharmaceutical industry, not specifically to COVID-19 vaccine doses. I think South Africa has had quite a high incidence of the pandemic, but a key factor there was that the South African variant, which emerged in, which was prominent in February, March, there was studies which found that it wasn't the AstraZeneca vaccine manufactured, well, which wherever it was manufactured would not be as effective against that variant. So the South African government did actually have some of those vaccines which had been supplied from India, and then actually either returned those vaccines or supplied them on elsewhere, because it decided that the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine would not be as effective against that variant. So there was actually some turning down of vaccines that were already, that could have been used in the country because of concerns about the effectiveness of that vaccine. And South Africa, since a lot of its attention has gone to Johnson & Johnson and some less doses from elsewhere, but there is some manufacturing of the final stage of the vaccine through Aspen in a collaboration with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So in a way, its attentions have turned more towards other vaccine manufacturers, which are less currently prominently manufactured in India, and more towards other companies and sources.
Hello? Hello?
Sir, please.
Okay. Hello, Dr. Horner. It was a really nice talk, and you have clearly mentioned the role of Indian industries across the South Africa for providing the therapeutic agent, especially in pharmaceutical sectors. And by highlighting the COVID-19 cases, you have clearly illustrated with several examples. My question is, in addition to this COVID-19, the other challengeful problems like the so-called Ebola, similarly avian flu, malaria, HIV, all those cases, and what is your opinion about the contribution of this Indian industry to treating this illness, especially in South Africa? That is my first question. Then the second one, what are the major challenges in terms of the FDA approval and perspectives for any, vaccine manufacturers or vaccine companies to reach out the South African places? Is there any issues and problems like that? Could you please throw some light on these two aspects?
Sure, very good questions. In terms of supply of antiretrovirals, India is playing an enormous role to South Africa. I don't have the exact numbers. Partly this industry is in some ways quite secretive when you start researching it for quite a long period of time, and you really have to pick up bits of information in a lot of different places. But India is the big player in supplying antiretrovirals to South Africa and many other drugs that are really significant for public health. And of course, it's not just South Africa; it's elsewhere too. And that's where this, in a way, tension has emerged between the Ministry of Health and the Department of Trade and Industry, which the Health Ministry's interest is in getting drugs that are good quality and effective, but the most drugs for the limited budget it has, and India provides that. The Department of Trade and Industry's interest, of course, is in having more local manufacturing. So those two policy objectives can come into tension with each other and have there, but it's because but the Health Ministry has been made very prominent statements and relies on public procurement from India a lot. In terms of the quality approvals, so South Africa's Medicines Control Council does have a very high regulatory standard, to such an extent that actually drugs kind of manufactured in South Africa or from India for South Africa will often be there'll be a sort of separate manufactured drug and from a separate factory compared to drugs manufactured for other countries in Africa, because the cost of producing to that quality standard is significantly higher. So there are much less, relative to other countries, there are much less Indian companies present in South Africa because there is a much higher quality regulatory standard. There is a much wider range of Indian companies which are present in many other African countries where you do not necessarily need to reach a standard equivalent to the South African Medicines Control Council. In terms of the processing of the registration and approval, partly because of the significance of India, South African regulators are frequently present in India, but South African companies do kind of play roles with Indian companies in processing of the approvals and registration, and like the way the US FDA is also significant in India, and India has the most US FDA approved pharmaceutical plants of anywhere in the world, at least outside the United States, and maybe even now more than in the United States. I'm not sure about the last part, but definitely more than any other country outside the United States. So the Indian companies can get quality approvals for the highest quality standards in the world. It's just there's also a variety of companies producing to different quality standards.
Thank you, Professor Horner.
So 1 minute for all. We have attached a feedback form, and that is in the chat box. Please take your time, all of you, please take your time to fill that feedback form. Thank you. You can continue the discussion.
Dr. Rory, really must thank and salute for your wonderful presentation. As a student of economics, we are expecting a different dimension in the post-corona time. Post-corona time, the government, both Indian and the world governments, are expecting a different dimensions in the health sector. what is your expectations about Indian companies in South Africa in terms of post-corona situation?
Thank you. I understand the question was about post-corona times and the role of Indian companies in South Africa. I mean, I guess many countries are still far from post-pandemic times, unfortunately at the moment, and the world as a whole is too. I think in terms of future pandemic preparedness, there is a big question about how to finance the capacity of vaccine manufacturing. So at the moment, the Serum Institute does a lot of manufacturing for UNICEF, for example, but is there going to be any coordination of cross governments to actually finance its capacity expansion or that of other manufacturers to pay for that vaccine, even when there is not a pandemic, those vaccines? Because there is, of course, money available now during a pandemic to pay for them, but that capacity has had to come from somewhere. And of course, there wasn't enough capacity in the world at the moment. So a key question is who's going to finance, and will it just be left to, if it's just left to the private sector, then the private sector will produce whatever the existing demand is, but not necessarily for that. So I think that's what the world really needs coordination on. I expect more broadly Indian companies to continue to play key roles. I think there is more policy agendas in a number of countries around local manufacturing. There may be more expectation on Indian companies to do a little bit more local manufacturing in some countries rather than just to import from India. But it's also much harder to turn that policy goal of local manufacturing into a reality. Many countries, from the United States to Africa to in Europe, are talking about local manufacturing in the context of the pandemic, because all countries are aware now of how reliant they are on supplies of essential medical goods from other countries. And of course, there's a broader fear of China, which plays out in many countries too. But while politicians might talk about we need more local manufacturing of these goods when there's a crisis, another thing, are they going to deliver the policy support and actually make that a reality? But I do think there will be some more expectation probably on Indian companies to do more local manufacturing elsewhere, just in the same way that there's a goal within India to reduce some sourcing from China at the current time as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry.
So, any further questions?
Or maybe if students are asking one or two questions, it would be nice. Students.
Hi, sir.
Hello.
Nice class, sir. And thank you. Share valuable information. Many African countries are having 15 to 20% tax on pharmaceuticals. How this can be justified?
Okay. I think it might vary by the drug. As far as I'm aware, there is very little import duties on, or no import duties on most drugs. So I don't. So and this is actually something which local manufacturers in Africa complain about from an industry point of view. So local manufacturers in Africa have to pay import duties on the ingredients, because there is an import duty on the ingredients, but there is not an import duty on the finished drug from a health policy point of view. So this means that local manufacturers have to pay extra for the raw materials compared to what they would elsewhere. So I've encountered this issue of import duties from people I interview much more about their industrialists complaining in Africa about the lack of import duty on a finished drug, which makes Indian imports cheaper, but there being import duties on the ingredients. I'm not so sure about, I haven't come across much people in health policy makers or industrialists in Africa talking much about the tax being a key issue.
Thank you, sir.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
Sir, do you think strict control over pharmaceutical manufacturers are required during this pandemic time, since there are high chances of exploitation?
I think there's always need for strict control on pharmaceuticals from a regulatory point of view. I mean, pharmaceuticals are more than perhaps any other industry. If they go wrong, they also have potential for devastating consequences. That's not just for vaccines, that's for drugs, and it's why this is one of the most regulated industries in the world. And so I agree with you that there is a need for strict control, and I think in many ways that there, at least in the context of COVID vaccines, there really has been, well, most regulators have tried to take as strict an approach as possible, although of course there is always pressure for urgency time-wise to approve vaccines. There's a big question marks about how much, at what stage of the trials and at what stage of the data do you do emergency use authorization, where we have had COVID-19 vaccines approved in record time compared to any other vaccines previously. But I guess the key thing is regulation is always needed in this industry. It does vary. My research has really found that you cannot, going beyond COVID-19 vaccines, it's very difficult to even generalize that, oh, all Indian drugs are of a particular quality, because there are different companies and there are different regulatory channels through which drugs are being approved. So there are variations within India. There's variations across many other countries too, but there's always a need to have security and clarity over what drug and vaccine is being supplied.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Hi, sir. Good afternoon.
Hi.
My question. China has, sorry, sir. India is always supported by Africa through low-cost generic medicine for treating HIV and malaria. How it will affect other pharmaceutical in the markets?
So how does India supply other pharmaceutical markets? I mean, so I guess I've focused more here on Africa, partly because I think the significance of India compared to other sources of supply is huge in Africa. And of course, the developmental consequences are enormous in Africa, especially lots of good things have come from Indian companies there. But Indian companies do supply many other countries elsewhere in the world too. I think some other parts of the world, there are also, of course, other suppliers too, for example, from China, but China tends to specialize more in the ingredients and India in the final formulation. So what we find is that a lot of Indian companies, for example, are present actually in Europe and North America too, but they tend to do contract manufacturing for European and North American companies. So not everybody in Europe and North America is necessarily aware of the extent that these drugs come from India, but sometimes it's at earlier stages of the supply chain that Indian companies manufacture, but they are still there and they're still significant so that's why some people say we should have the term pharmacy to the world, not just pharmacy to the developing world, to describe India's pharmaceutical industry.
Thank you, sir.
Students, is there any further questions?
Okay, Miss, then we may go for the formal vote of thanks.
Okay, then. Okay, it seems the questions and doubt session. It seems the questions are almost over, so we can move to the vote of thanks ceremony. So I invite Dr. Justin Joy, the faculty of Department of Development Economics, to express a word of gratitude.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Justin, and I'm here to present word of thanks for this webinar. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Rory Horner for joining us despite of his busy schedule. I hope we didn't spoil your beautiful morning, sir. Actually, Rory Horner is doing his research on Indian pharmaceutical industry since 2013 and was continuously publishing papers related to these areas. So maybe he would be the right person to speak on these areas with such an authority. Economic geography being less explored in Indian economics academic world, maybe he would be the right person to address these issues, and we are so happy to have you, sir. On behalf of the institution, I would like to extend our great gratitude for your talk and valuable time you spent for us. Thank you, sir. And we are looking forward for more future collaborations in the future. And also, I would like to thank the organizing committee, head of the department, our principal, and our dear students who actually worked hard for this event. Dear participants, we thank for your active participation and wonderful discussions. Thank you all. And there's a small announcement. All participants are requested to fill the feedback form, which is circulated in the chat box. And e-certificate will be issued based on manual validation by the organizing committee. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rory. Maybe we can wind up formally here.
And thank you all for the invitation again and the conversation. I really enjoyed it, and it was a pleasure to be with you